Let's quote a little Shakespeare here and say, instead of to be or not to be, to trust or not to trust. That is the question here on Phil's Tax Hacks and Other Retirement Facts. Welcome into Phil's Tax Hacks and Other Retirement Facts with CPA and personal financial specialist, Phil Putney. Now let's get rolling with today's show. Hey everybody, welcome into the podcast. Phil and I are here to talk investing, finance, and retirement, and trust, man. Trust is a hard thing to come by in the world. And when you come to your finances, Phil, trusting people with my dough is it's scary, right?
It is.
It's some scary stuff.
Little
So
bit
who do you
trust?
trust?
But this is,
Yeah. Well, and so I know we're going to talk about the other kind of trust too.
Right.
But it's still the same thing. It's still your money, right? So Do you trust, do you not trust your finances to, this entity or that entity, or do you put things here or there, or, is a will good enough, or so on and so forth, right? Or I'm not a Rockefeller, so I can't do a trust,
or whatever the case is. Or whatever the case is. So,
right. Yeah. So let's get into this conversation a little bit about trust this week on the podcast. Should you have one? Well, let's just start right there. I'm not rich. Should I have one?
Yeah.
Right?
And so as we get into this, let me just preface, I'm not an attorney. This isn't legal advice, right?
Right.
So this is just my perspective as a financial advisor or CPA, what I've seen over the years, right? So should you have a trust? And at the end of the day, it really depends. I think it, for years had become kind of a commonplace rubber stamp. You get an estate plan included the trust and the will and the durable and the medical and living will. I mean, all these different pieces, which are all have their specific role in it, but they kind of throw a trust in there, which, you may or may not need. And it is funny because this really came up because of a prospective client I'm recently working with and now becoming a client that, we got into that discussion of they've got a trust and as they got into it, it's like, I don't know why we really even have this. Should we have it? So, yeah.
Could be. So what are some reasons to have one then?
So probably the number one reason that people think of having a trust is, well, I don't want to pay probate. I don't want to go through probate,
right?
I want to avoid probate, which, I mean, that's how it was, I don't want to say sold, but that's how it was presented to them and why they had it.
Well, if you just have a will, Phil, just so for people to know, if you just have a will, you will, I was taught to remember, if you just have a will, you will go through probate.
Right. So a will is simply the direction, your direction to the probate court of what you want them to do with your assets. That's all a will is, right? But the key to understanding will or trust is really coming back to the rules of how assets pass, right? Because it doesn't matter whether you have a will or a trust if they come down the line, right? So for instance, ownership is number one. So when you die, the first thing that happens is assets pass according to ownership. So if you have assets that are owned jointly, it doesn't matter what your will or trust says, it goes to the joint owner. Even if your trust said that, well, I want that asset to go to somebody else. If the trust didn't own it, you still had joint owners. Well, it doesn't matter what the trust says, it goes, So the next one is beneficiary.
Okay.
So if it's an account that has a beneficiary, so retirement accounts, IRAs, Roth IRAs, 401ks, life insurance, annuities, those type of vehicles, they all have beneficiary designations. That's number two. So even if you said in your will or whatever it is that you wanted that or trust that it goes to a certain beneficiary, well, I'm sorry, if that will or that trust wasn't named as beneficiary, it doesn't matter. Even if it was in a will and you said, I want it to go to this person, if you name somebody else as beneficiary, oops, I changed my mind, but forgot to change my beneficiary designation.
And we've talked about that a million times.
Right. There's
the BD trumps everything, right?
Right. There's court cases out there that say, nope, sorry, beneficiary designation trumps. So those are the first two hurdles of avoiding probate. If you can avoid probate through those, then you really don't need a trust. And it's more common today that you don't need a trust to avoid probate for most assets. So we talked about IRA accounts, those type of accounts, retirement accounts, life insurance, annuities, all those are going to pass by beneficiaries. So it doesn't matter. So the other two big ones oftentimes are going to be some type of real estate, or what about like the bank accounts or the non-retirement type accounts? Well, so real estate, at least in Michigan, you can use what's called a ladybird deed. And that just adds beneficiary designations to the deed so that in the event that you and your spouse, if it's joint ownership, pass, it avoids probate and goes to whoever that beneficiary is in the Ladybird deed. So with the bank accounts, the non-retirement type accounts, brokerage accounts, you can add what's called a TOD, or a transfer on death. Same thing. Those accounts by their nature originally don't have beneficiary designations, but if your custodian or your bank allows, you can add this transfer on death designation, which basically gives a beneficiary designation.
And these are reasons that you might have normally done a trust. So there
Right.
are some ways to do that without having to go through one.
Right. So, there are other options. Don't think
Okay.
of, well, I want to avoid probate, so I've got to go to a trust.
Okay.
Right? Because there are potentially other options that may make more sense.
Well,
So-
that's kind of like the investing thing for most of us. We tend to sit, we've talked about it before, where people are like, well, I only have two options. It's the market or cash, and or the bank, right? And it's
Right.
like, well, no, there's a plethora of options out there that you could be doing. And we've pretty much grown up thinking, well, a will, and probate, or a trust. But there are some, so there's definitely some caveats in there.
Right. So other reasons you might want to own it then is it really comes down to control, right? So if it's probate, maybe not. There could be other options. So another good reason to have a trust is having control beyond the grave, so to speak. You pass away, and I always say a trust is good if you don't trust, right? So
I was gonna say, are we going with I don't trust my heirs to do something responsible?
So I pass away and I'm worried that my heirs aren't going to be responsible. So where this comes into play is you have minor children. Well, yeah, you don't want to name your newborn as the beneficiary on your company plan, because if you pass away, they're going to get the money, but they can't own it. So it's going to end up in probate. And they're going to be in probate until they're 18, and there's going to be a conservator appointed. I mean, it's going to be just a disaster, right? So you want to maybe then name a trust so that you can, through that, name somebody to oversee it for their benefit, or you set up trust where, at certain ages, my kids get the money, right? Because I know that just naturally as you age, they become more responsible. So if you want that kind of control, is what it comes down to. You want to be able to say, hey, at these stages, this is what happens. Then a trust can do that. Now, if your kids are all way beyond that and your trust simply says take the money and divide it, well, you don't really need a trust to do that, right?
Okay. All right.
So protection of assets, though, could be another reason. So if you're worried that
lawsuit,
divorce, things of that nature, just with the beneficiaries, well, then a trust can help with that. So.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously having more assets, certainly. And I said earlier on in this that, well, I'm not rich or I'm not a Rockefeller, so I don't need a trust. But, what becomes that line of I've got enough assets that I do want to protect it? And again, your life is different, right? So if you've got some teenage kids and, or driving age kids, and you do have some sizable assets, maybe a trust is something you're looking to do to protect against lawsuits or, who knows, right? Car accidents, whatever. So,
right. Yeah. So age of beneficiaries definitely plays into it, and the beneficiaries themselves. Amount of assets plays some, but I mean, at the end of the day, if you have $10 million and when you pass, you just want it to be divided amongst your 3 or 4 kids, whatever it is, or whoever, well, you don't need a trust to do that. And it's just another hurdle to go through to get there, potentially.
Okay. All right.
So special needs trust, I mean, that is definitely
that can be a big one.
Trust. So if you do have a beneficiary that is on some kind of government assistance due to they have special needs, absolutely need a trust for that, because now you have to put some parameters around when and how they can gain access to that so they don't lose those benefits. So you don't want them to, you have $100,000 and they inherit it. Well, now they've lost all their benefits and they're going to spend through that within a few years probably. And now they've got to go through the whole scenario again to get back on. So that, even with lower assets, I would argue you're probably wanting to look at a special needs trust, because you want to protect that beneficiary and the benefits that they potentially have.
And is it hard to change? Like whom you name in your trust, is that hard to change?
No, and that's another reason potentially to have a trust is it's a lot easier, right? So I mean, if you have accounts all over the place and you decide to change beneficiaries, well, if you have named individual beneficiaries, now you have to go to each one of those accounts and make sure you changed it.
So but if you've named the trust,
Right. So it's definitely a little bit more work that way. If you've named the trust already on all those accounts and you decide to change a beneficiary, you just change the trust.
Okay. You change the umbrella for lack of...
There's pros and cons, right? It's easier from that standpoint to manage. And again, that the whole goal of all of this is not to say don't do a trust. It's to say know the pros and cons, know your scenario, and make a more informed decision. And that's how we approach everything with our clients. Is I'm not here to tell you do it or don't do it. It's here's the pro, here's the con, here's your scenario, here's what I'd recommend and why, but it's your plan. What do you want to do?
Yeah, we're all about the education on this podcast. So
yes, it's all about
all about the education.
The Tax Smart Retiree is your comprehensive guide to mastering tax efficiency for a flourishing retirement. You will find indispensable advice and actionable strategies designed to enhance tax savings, maximize Social Security benefits, protect against market volatility, and develop a customized retirement plan. To get your free ebook, click the link in the show notes of today's episode and download your copy of the Tax Smart Retiree right now.
All right, so what's some downsides to the trust, Phil?
So downside is they can be costly to maintain. Right. So especially if it's going to continue beyond the grave, so to speak. So
is that kind of an annual thing?
Yeah. So you're going to have somebody has to be the trustee. Who's running this trust? Who's buying and selling and making distributions and all those determinations? Well, that's going to be maybe one of the beneficiaries, or is it going to be a third party? They're going to charge a fee for that. So there's going to be some fees associated with that. A trust at that point becomes a separate legal taxable entity. So you're going to have to work probably with a CPA to at least file an annual tax return, do some accounting to be able to file that tax return. So, I mean, there's ongoing maintenance fees that are going to come with that. So, and taxes are probably one of the bigger pieces of it that very often get overlooked, I would say, especially from the attorney standpoint, because they don't understand the tax side. And again, like I mentioned in the beginning, I'm not an attorney, but this is the tax side of a trust. So let's say that, you really didn't trust your beneficiaries and wanted to place some guidelines on it. All your money's in an IRA. So, and this is going to kind of tie into another of the downside, but then back to the taxes. So another downside to the trust, especially in that scenario, is a trust as a named beneficiary on a retirement account or annuity has to take that money out in 5 years.
Okay. Big tip.
Versus a named beneficiary today has to take it out typically
10 years.
In 10 years. I mean, there's some other exceptions. It used to be better than that. It used to be a stretch, right? So you could stretch it out over their lifetime.
Right.
So it's come down to not as big of a difference, but it's still a pretty big difference. Okay. So
sure.
If a trust is named,
5 years is 5 years. Yeah.
Everything in 5 versus a beneficiary takes it in 10.
For your example, if you're talking about like $1 million IRA, I mean, that's 5 years could be a sizable amount of money you got to pull out.
Right. So $200,000 a year taxable versus if it's in an individual, $100,000 a year. Right. So why does that matter from a tax standpoint though when it comes to the trust? Okay. So from a trust standpoint, and this is where some people think, well, I want to trust because it saves me in taxes. It does not save you in taxes. In fact, it costs you significantly more if the trust retains the asset. So if you think this through and say, well, I want the trust because I want to protect the asset from the kids. They're not able to respond. They're not responsible enough to handle it. So now I had $1 million IRA. The trust is named. I have to take out $200,000 or the trust has to take out $200,000 this year. So a trust is what's called a pass-through entity, meaning that it will pay the taxes unless it distributes those assets where the tax then passes through the trust to the beneficiary. So if the goal of the trust in the beginning was to protect the assets from the beneficiary, the trust is going to retain it. Has a $200,000 IRA distribution. The trust hits the top federal marginal bracket of 37% at $15,200 of income.
That's it?
Yeah. So giving some perspective, a married couple today doesn't hit that bracket until $578,000 of income.
Wow.
So the IRS does not like trusts, right? So that if you leave
that's a big number.
If you leave money in a trust, make sure you know that, because you could be sacrificing, by the time you layer on the state, 40% of the money just to maintain control. So what's control worth? Right?
Yeah, that's a great point.
So understand, because in the reality with this is this happens, you did all this work up front. If this wasn't factored into it, your trustee is now dealing with this, and maybe they don't even know. So they think, well, the trust says I can't make, and if the trust says I can't make distributions until this, and this, they don't have an option. They can't do it. They now are forced into paying 40% in taxes.
And to your point, maybe this was sold as part of an attorney package or something like that, not knocking attorneys, right. But they just don't understand that part of the tax side of it. And now you take this to your CPA who goes, well, you're kind of screwed here on this or whatever. You realize,
and so you just have to understand the big picture, right? So to trust or not to trust it, not to say they're good or bad. It's a vehicle. It's a tool like anything else. It has its good points. It does very well at what it does, but there's some cost and some snags along the way, so to speak, that you've got to understand how it works. And is it worth the cons to get the pros?
Yeah. All right. Well, there you go. But there you go. To trust or not to trust.
So if you do have a trust, I would encourage you just to go back and look at number one. And the next thing with the trust is at the end of the day, you can have a trust, but if nothing's named to go to the trust, it doesn't matter anyways. And unfortunately, that's where a lot of people end up is they go to the attorney, they get this estate planning done. Here's the trust. The attorney hands them a sheet of paper that says, well, here's how you fund the trust. You got to name all your bank accounts,
and they never
your
do.
Non-qualified accounts, your beneficiary, whatever it is. And they won't typically give you advice on that. And that's where it ends. The trust sits on the shelf in a book. But if nothing is named to go into that trust, well, it doesn't really matter. It's a paper on a shelf.
If you go through this process, Phil, and you do have one and you decide you don't need one or you get a reevaluation, can you dissolve it while you're still around and get that all taken care of?
Well, so, you don't even have to dissolve it. Just make sure nothing goes there.
Oh, okay.
So, if nothing is named in that trust, then it's an empty trust and it doesn't go anywhere. It just is gone. So,
okay.
But right. the key to that too is that most attorneys, when they're setting this up, because the goal again is usually getting money to the trust. So they'll have what's called a pour over will. So even if you haven't named things in the trust, a pour over will have as kind of its last paragraph that says anything not specifically named, to go to a beneficiary in this document goes into XYZ trust.
Aha.
So, it could end up in the trust anyways if it hits probate, because remember, the will is the direction of probate.
Gotcha.
So if it's jumped out ahead of time because it's a joint ownership or because it's, beneficiary designation, it doesn't make it there. But if it ends up in probate and the will says it goes to the trust, well, now the trust just got funded. But you're kind of defeated the whole purpose because now you paid probate to get the money in the trust.
So to trust or not to trust, maybe do a little digging, maybe do a little research, and don't just necessarily get sold a package deal or something like that. Find out if it's the right fit for you all the way around. And of course, as Phil said a couple of times, he's not an attorney. He certainly works with estate attorneys and then planning attorneys and things of that nature. But as a CPA, he's often thinking about things from that tax side of things. So just make sure you're talking with a financial team when it comes to getting yourself, into that situation, whether you need to trust or not. And if you need some help, as always, reach out to Phil, 248-888-7530. Numbers on the screen, 248-888-7530 for those folks checking us out in audio form. And stop by and visit him at philstaxhacks.com. That's philstaxhacks.com. Get yourself onto the calendar, have a consultation or a review, reach out to him. And don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. That's going to do it this week for us here on the podcast. We'll catch you next time here on Phil's Tax Hacks and Other Retirement Facts.
Investment advisory services offered through AFS Wealth Management. The content of this program is provided for informational purposes only and is not a solicitation or recommendation of any investment strategy. Investments and/or investment strategies involve risk, including the possible loss of principal. There is no assurance that any investment strategy will achieve its objectives.